June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy. Smoke fills the air. Machine guns thunder from the cliffs above. Young American soldiers sprint across the sand, knowing that every second they remain exposed could be their last. Somewhere ahead, a German infantryman raises his carabiner 98K. One shot. He works the bolt. Another shot. But before he can fire a third, an American soldier unleashes 8 rounds in rapid succession. The battle changes instantly. The difference isn't courage. It isn't training. It's the rifle. General George S. Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. But how did one rifle earn such extraordinary praise? And could a single weapon really change the outcome of a world war? This is the story of the M1 Garand. Before the Garand, to understand why the M1 Garand was revolutionary, you first had to understand the world it entered. For centuries, soldiers had accepted one simple truth. Fire. Reload. Fire again. Early muskets took nearly a minute to reload. Bolt-action rifles improved that dramatically, but every shot still required the shooter to pull back the bolt, eject the empty cartridge, load the next round, and reacquire the target. It was a reliable system. But it came at a cost. Every time a soldier cycled the bolt, their eyes briefly left the battlefield. Those precious seconds often meant the difference between life and death. Military leaders believed this was simply the way war would always be fought. Then one engineer dared to imagine something different. His name was John Garand. Ironically, the man who would create America's most famous military rifle wasn't even born in the United States. Garand was born in Quebec, Canada, in 1888. As a young boy, he worked in textile mills before developing an extraordinary talent for machinery. Unlike many inventors, Garand wasn't driven by fame. He was obsessed with solving problems. He believed machines could always be improved. Made simpler. Made stronger. Made more reliable. Those principles would eventually define the rifle that carried his name. After moving to the United States, Garand joined the U.S. government's Springfield Armory, where he began working on one of the military's greatest engineering challenges. Could a rifle reload itself without sacrificing reliability? It sounded almost impossible. Many believed it couldn't be done. A radical idea at the time, the U.S. Army trusted one rifle above all others. The M1903 Springfield. It was accurate, reliable, and battle-tested. Military officers admired its precision. They saw little reason to replace it. In fact, many senior commanders distrusted the very idea of a semi-automatic rifle. They feared soldiers would waste ammunition, fire too quickly, lose discipline. To them, accuracy mattered far more than speed. Garand disagreed. He wasn't designing a rifle for a shooting competition. He was designing one for war. He believed that when bullets were flying, the soldier who could stay focused on the enemy, instead of operating a bolt, would always have the advantage. It was a bold theory. One that challenged decades of military thinking. Turning that idea into reality proved far more difficult than anyone expected. Prototype after prototype failed. Some jammed. Others overheated. Some simply broke apart under the stress of repeated firing. Each failure sent Garand back to the drawing board. Months became years. Funding was questioned. Army officials grew impatient. Some argued the entire project should be abandoned. After all, Why spend millions developing an unproven rifle, when the Springfield already worked? But Garand refused to give up. Every setback taught him something new. Every failure brought him one step closer to the design that would eventually change military history. He wasn't just building a better rifle. He was quietly redefining the future of infantry combat. While Garand continued refining his invention, the world beyond Springfield Armory was changing. Across Europe, new leaders were rising. Armies were growing. Factories were working around the clock. The shadow of another global war stretched across the horizon. The United States wasn't officially involved. Not yet. But military planners knew one thing. If America was drawn into another world war, its soldiers would need every possible advantage. The question was, would the Army trust a completely new rifle, just as the world stood on the edge of catastrophe? Or would tradition win, one last time? After nearly a decade of relentless testing, John Garand finally placed his latest prototype before the U.S. Army. It was faster, more reliable, unlike anything soldiers had ever carried into battle. Some officers believed they were looking at the future. Others believed they were looking at a dangerous mistake. The decision they were about to make would shape every battlefield America entered during World War II. And perhaps, the outcome of the war itself. When John Garand unveiled his rifle, not everyone was impressed. To some officers, it represented the future. But to many others, it represented a dangerous gamble. For decades, the American military had trusted one principle above all else. A disciplined soldier, firing carefully aimed shots, would always defeat one who fired too quickly. The bolt-action Springfield had reinforced that philosophy for years. It rewarded patience. It rewarded precision. And it forced every soldier to slow down between shots. To many senior commanders, that wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. Then came Garand's rifle. A weapon capable of firing 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. To younger officers, that sounded revolutionary. To older generals, it sounded reckless. They'll waste all their ammunition, one concern kept surfacing again and again. What if soldiers fired too fast? It might sound strange today, but many military leaders genuinely believed that giving infantrymen a semi-automatic rifle would create chaos. Instead of carefully choosing their shots, they feared soldiers would panic, empty all 8 rounds within seconds, and find themselves defenseless. A rifle was more than a weapon. It represented discipline, control, training. Some believed the Garand threatened all three. John Garand listened to the criticism. But he understood something many of the generals had never experienced firsthand. Real combat rarely resembled a shooting competition. It was loud, confusing, fast. In those moments, the soldier who could keep firing without breaking his concentration held a priceless advantage. The battlefield was changing, whether the army wanted to admit it or not. The only way to settle the debate was through testing. Again and again, Garand's rifle was pushed to its limits. It fired thousands of rounds. It was exposed to dust, mud, rain, and freezing temperatures. Army evaluators wanted to know one thing. Could a self-loading rifle survive the brutal conditions of combat? Or would it become another ambitious experiment that failed when soldiers needed it most? There were setbacks. Parts occasionally failed. Minor adjustments had to be made. Garand returned to his workshop time after time, refining springs, improving components, eliminating weaknesses. Each revision brought the rifle closer to perfection. He wasn't chasing innovation anymore. He was chasing reliability. Because a brilliant rifle that failed in battle was no masterpiece at all. Just when it seemed Garand's design was gaining momentum, another challenger appeared. The Peterson rifle. Designed by the respected firearms inventor John Peterson, it quickly became Garand's biggest competitor. Many Army officials admired it. Some believed it was the better choice. The competition became intense. Both rifles underwent extensive testing. Supporters argued passionately for their favorite design. For a time, it appeared entirely possible that history would remember the Peterson rifle instead of the Garand. One decision, made in a conference room far from any battlefield, would determine which weapon America's soldiers would carry into the next war. Months of testing, reports, arguments, and demonstrations finally led to the moment everyone had been waiting for. The U.S. Army made its choice. In 1936, the rifle officially entered service. It would be known simply as the United States Rifle, caliber .30 M1. Today, the world knows it by another name, the M1 Garand. For John Garand, it was the culmination of years of relentless work. For the Army, it was a leap into an uncertain future. No one yet realized that they had just adopted one of the most influential infantry rifles in military history. Adopting a rifle on paper was one thing. Putting it into the hands of millions of soldiers was something entirely different. Springfield Armory immediately began preparing for mass production. Every component had to be manufactured with extraordinary precision. Workers assembled rifles one by one, carefully inspecting each part before it ever reached a soldier. Then, history intervened. Across Europe, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. At first, the United States remained on the sidelines. But everyone understood the truth. Sooner or later, America would almost certainly be drawn into the conflict. When that day came, the success or failure of the M1 Garand would no longer be decided in testing grounds. It would be decided on the battlefield. On December 7, 1941, everything changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into World War II. Almost overnight, millions of young Americans were handed the same rifle John Garand had spent years perfecting. Many had never fired a weapon before. Within months, they would carry the M1 Garand into North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, and eventually, the beaches of Normandy. There, under enemy fire, the world would finally discover whether John Garand had truly built the rifle that won World War II. For years, the M1 Garand had existed inside factories, testing grounds, and military reports. Now, it would face its greatest test: war. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, millions of young Americans answered the call to serve. Many had never left their hometown. Some had never even held a rifle. Within weeks, they found themselves standing in training camps, where instructors placed an unfamiliar weapon into their hands. It felt heavier than they expected. Made from solid steel and walnut wood, the Garand weighed nearly 10 pounds. It wasn't designed to be comfortable. It was designed to survive. Before long, these young recruits would carry it across deserts, through frozen forests, over mountains, and onto beaches stained by war. The Garand first proved itself in North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy. Every campaign pushed both soldiers and their equipment to the limit. Dust clogged moving parts. Mud covered every surface. rain-soaked uniforms, and rifles alike. Many weapons failed under such punishment. The Garand didn't. Its gas-operated action continued cycling, shot after shot, even in conditions that would cripple less reliable firearms. American soldiers quickly developed enormous confidence in their new rifle. It wasn't perfect. But when their lives depended on it, they trusted it. That trust became one of the weapon's greatest strengths. The greatest advantage of the M1 Garand wasn't simply accuracy. It was speed. Imagine two soldiers meeting unexpectedly in dense woodland. One carries Germany's Karabiner 98K. The other, an M1 Garand. The German soldier fires. Works the bolt. Realigns his sights. Fires again. Meanwhile, the American rifleman keeps both hands exactly where they belong. 1 shot. 2. 3. 4. 5. Without ever taking his eyes off the target. Those extra seconds often determined who walked away, and who didn't. For the first time in military history, an ordinary infantryman possessed firepower that rivaled an entire squad from just a generation earlier. The battlefield itself had changed. Then came June 6th. D-Day. As thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, the M1 Garand was no longer an experiment. It had become America's primary battle rifle. Landing craft dropped their ramps. Machine gun fire erupted from fortified German bunkers. Mortars exploded across the sand. The air filled with smoke, steel, and fear. Through the chaos, countless American soldiers relied on the Garand to fight their way inland. Historians often debate which weapons shaped World War II. Tanks, aircraft, artillery. But on the beaches, victory still depended on the individual infantryman. And for many of them, the Garand became the difference between advancing or never leaving the shoreline. The M1 Garand did something few weapons ever achieved. It changed how soldiers thought. Instead of waiting, they attacked. Instead of carefully conserving every round, they could overwhelm enemy positions with rapid, accurate fire. German troops soon noticed the difference. Many were accustomed to facing bolt-action rifles. American infantry operated differently. They fired faster, pressed harder, moved more aggressively. The Garand didn't simply improve American firepower. It changed the rhythm of combat itself. The rifle gave soldiers confidence. And confidence can become one of the most powerful weapons on any battlefield. Yet no discussion of the M1 Garand is complete without mentioning one sound. A sound recognized by generations of soldiers. After firing the 8th and final round, the empty en-bloc clip automatically ejected from the rifle, producing a sharp metallic ping. Over time, a story began spreading among veterans and historians. German soldiers, it was said, learned to recognize the sound. Whenever they heard that distinctive ping, they knew the American rifle was empty. Some supposedly waited for that exact moment before launching their attack. It became one of the most famous stories surrounding the Garand. But was it actually true? Or had one of military history's greatest legends grown larger than reality? The answer is more complicated than most people realize. The metallic ping became one of the most recognizable sounds of World War II. Some believed it saved lives. Others believed it cost lives. Even today, military historians continue debating whether the famous ping was a fatal flaw or a battlefield myth. But regardless of where the truth lies, one fact remains impossible to ignore. By the end of the war, millions of soldiers trusted the M1 Garand with their lives. And its influence was only beginning. Few military stories have been repeated more often than this one. The moment an M1 Garand fired its eighth and final round, the empty on-block clip was automatically ejected. Ping. According to the legend, German soldiers learned to recognize that unmistakable sound. Hearing it supposedly told them one thing: the American rifleman was out of ammunition. It was time to attack. It's a dramatic story. And for decades, it has appeared in books, movies, and countless conversations between military enthusiasts. But did it actually happen? Most historians today believe, probably not. On a battlefield filled with machine guns, exploding artillery, tank engines, and thousands of soldiers firing simultaneously, the tiny metallic ping would have been almost impossible to hear from any meaningful distance. Even if an enemy soldier somehow recognized it, they would still have no idea whether other American soldiers nearby still had fully loaded rifles. Many veterans who carried the Garand into combat later dismissed the story entirely. Not because the ping didn't exist, it certainly did, but because real combat was simply too chaotic for such a tiny sound to matter. The myth survived. The battlefield evidence never truly supported it. If the Garand had a flaw, its users were remarkably willing to forgive it. Ask veterans why they trusted the rifle, and the answers were remarkably consistent. It worked. Again, and again, and again. It survived mud, rain, snow, dust, long marches, brutal combat. Its powerful .3006 cartridge could reach farther, hit harder, and penetrate cover more effectively than many competing rifles. It wasn't the lightest weapon, nor the easiest to carry. But when lives depended on reliability, few rifles earned greater respect. For millions of American servicemen, the M1 Garand became more than standard equipment. It became a trusted companion. When World War II finally came to an end, the influence of the Garand was only beginning. Military planners around the world had witnessed something remarkable. A standard infantry rifle, issued to ordinary soldiers, had dramatically increased battlefield firepower. The days of relying exclusively on bolt-action service rifles were rapidly disappearing. Nations across the globe began developing their own semi-automatic battle rifles. The Garand had changed expectations forever. Its DNA could be seen in future American weapons, including the M14. And many of the concepts it introduced would eventually influence modern military rifle design. John Garand hadn't simply built a successful firearm. He had helped redefine infantry warfare. Perhaps no endorsement has become more famous than the one given by General George S. Patton. He reportedly described the M1 Garand as the greatest battle implement ever devised. It's an extraordinary statement, especially considering Patton commanded tanks, artillery, and entire armies. Yet he reserved his highest praise for the weapon carried by the ordinary infantryman. Because Patton understood something many people overlook. Wars are ultimately won by soldiers on the ground. And those soldiers fight with the tools placed in their hands. More than steel and wood today, the M1 Garand lives on in museums, historical collections, competitive shooting events, and military ceremonies. Collectors treasure original examples. Historians continue studying its design. Veterans still speak about it with remarkable affection. Not because it was perfect, but because it represented something larger. Innovation, reliability, confidence. It arrived at precisely the moment history needed it most. And in doing so, it became far more than a rifle. It became a symbol of an entire generation. History remembers many famous weapons. The Roman gladius, the English longbow, the Colt 1911, the AK-47. Each transformed warfare in its own way. The M1 Garand belongs in that company. Not because it fired the largest cartridge. Not because it was the most advanced weapon ever built. But because it gave ordinary soldiers an extraordinary advantage at one of history's most critical moments. It proved that innovation could overcome tradition. That courage supported by better technology could change the course of battle. And that sometimes, one invention, placed in the hands of millions, can help shape the outcome of history itself. Perhaps that's why, nearly a century after its introduction, the M1 Garand is still remembered with such respect. Not simply as a firearm, but as one of the most influential military rifles ever created. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to Weapons Vault. Every week, we explore the legendary weapons, military innovations, and remarkable stories that changed the course of history. Because behind every famous battlefield, there's a weapon, an invention, or a decision that changed everything. Until next time, stay curious.